Hello everyone and welcome back to Fire Emblem Month. Last time, we went through Binding Blade. And now, I'm about to go over what I consider one of, if not the best Fire Emblem game to date, as well as the first game in the series to be released overseas. And that is Fire Emblem Blazing Sword. Fire Emblem Blazing Sword is the 7th installment in the Fire Emblem series, the second on the Game Boy Advance, and the first game to be released here in the West. This game introduced many fans to the Fire Emblem series, including myself, so I may be a bit biased when I review this game, but for now, let's take a closer look. Fire Emblem Blazing Sword is a prequel that takes 20 years before the events of Binding Blade. Because this is a prequel to Binding Blade, Blazing Sword takes place on the continent of Elib. The player adopts the perspective of a tactician who is woken up by Lyn to start our story. The girl is named Lyn and is the only one of her kind since her parents were murdered by bandits. Because of this event, Lyn wants to become stronger so that she can avenge her father's death. Lyn eventually discovers that she is the granddaughter of the Marquess of Kyallen, Hausen, in which two knights from Lycia, Kent and Sane, tell her about this. Lyn recruits many other companions in order to stop Lundgren, her great uncle, from taking over the castle of Kyallen. Lyn and her companions succeed in taking down her great uncle, and Kyallen can finally remain in peace until 1 year later. This is where the story revolves around Eliwood, Hector, and their party for part 2 of the game. Since the game has multiple lords, there are multiple pathways. Kind of. There are a few unique chapters in each of the 2 pathways, whether you choose to follow the perspective of Eliwood or Hector. Lyn eventually joins back up with Eliwood and Hector, and now they have a new goal in mind. A month has passed since Eliwood's father, Lord Albert, has went missing, and he feels that it is right to go search for him. The group must stop an antagonistic force known as the Black Fang, under the leader of a sorcerer named Nergal. The group's ultimate goal is to stop the Black Fang from using their companions Ninian and Nils' life force in order to open the Dragon's Gate, a portal in which dragons reside, and thus ignite the conflict in the continent of Elib. The story may be basic, but it is still a great story. The story can get rather dark at points, and while I won't spoil it any further, the dark moments get pretty damn extreme. The darker tone of the game's story really makes it more interesting and relatable. Plus, I also really like the 3 lore storyline, and where in part 2, you can decide whether to look at the story in the perspective of either Eliwood or Hector. Overall, the story is great and is one of my favorites in the entire franchise. The overall gameplay is very similar to that of Binding Blade. Not much has changed concerning the core gameplay mechanics and features in Binding Blade, and while that isn't bad, the game isn't really trying to innovate the core mechanics. But the most significant change of the overall gameplay is the 3 Lord storyline. Lyn's storyline is the mandatory tutorial and helps ease players into the game. And as I previously mentioned, the second part of the game has the branching pathway between Eliwood and Hector. Hector's storyline is easily the hardest in the entire game, and Eliwood's is like the normal difficulty. Outside of the single-player campaign, The game also has a multiplayer link arena, similarly to Binding Blade and later Sacred Stones. Up to 4 players can link at a time using characters from the single player file. Players can choose up to 5 characters and equip them like you can do in the main story. This game is pretty much a rout the enemy scenario, as players take turns attacking one another and try to eliminate all their units. I unfortunately cannot give an opinion on this mode since I've never played it, even though it appears in the Fire Emblem Wiki and Wikipedia. If anyone has any real legit footage of this multiplayer arena link, please let me know in the comments. Also, like with Binding Blade, the sprite artwork in this game is incredible. My props going towards the battle animations because they just look really fucking cool. Also, the character roster is by far one of my favorites in the franchise. It may not be as good as Path of Radiance, Awakening, or Echoes, but we'll get to those games later. In fact, just to prove my statement even further, I do not hate any of the characters in this game. That's how good the cast is here. They are all either really interesting characters, or they're really useful units on the battlefield, or both. The only character from this cast that I probably hate is Sonya, but that's more of a love to hate her kind of deal. Speaking of Sonya, the villains are good. Really good, but they're not great. Nergal is a pretty good villain and he does have a motive for all of this. He was at one point friends with Athos, the living legend, at Arcadia, where dragons and humans coexisted peacefully. Nergal, however, was learning the ways of Quintessence, or the life force, and it was slowly distorting his soul. Nergal would then eventually escape to Bern, where he then takes control of the Black Fang. Now that I've got all the good stuff out of the way, let's talk about all the flaws, if there are any. So was I able to find any flaws with Blazing Sword? Okay, I couldn't find any flaws, but more like nitpicks, which just goes to show how greatly designed this game was in execution. My first nitpick are that clerics in this game are rather annoying. Because once you've leveled up at least once, you've used a majority of a heal staff. So it's best to keep more than one healing staff on your clerics. My second major nitpick are some specific chapters that really suck. Which is a real shame too, since Fire Emblem 7 in my opinion has some of the best level design in the entire franchise. However, there were 2 chapters that really got on my nerves: Living Legend and Battle Before Dawn. For the case of Living Legend, it's mainly because it's a desert map and that your units can barely move, except for mages and thieves. It's even worse in Hector's story when it's a desert and fog map. God damn it, I'm getting chapter 14 from Binding Blade vibes all over again. And for Battle Before Dawn, there's a few reasons. 1, it's a fog map. 2, you have to recruit both Nino and Jafar in order to unlock the Gaiden chapter, which is arguably the best chapter in the game. And 3, you have to guard Zephiel for 15 turns. And 4, the enemies are really strong. God, this chapter is such a pain in the ass. And personally, I don't think the soundtrack is that amazing. I mean, it's still a great soundtrack without a doubt with some standout songs, especially the character themes, but in my opinion, I've heard better. Alright, what do I think of Blazing Sword personally? Well, I believe it's one of the best games in the series, if not the best.
I'm still in a tie between Path of Radiance, Awakening, and this game for which one is the best, but hopefully I'll have a favorite later this month.
Everything in this game just works so naturally with each other. The story, the characters, the presentation, the soundtrack, the gameplay mechanics, all blend in very well with each other. I'll have to admit, both Path of Radiance and Awakening have quite the challenge in order to beat Blazing Sword. But we'll get to those games later.
So yeah, I find Fire Emblem Blazing Sword to be amazing, and my next review will be on the last Game Boy title.